Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, season 07, episode 15, where we confront a fundamental question from chapter 15 of Atkinson and Hilgard's Introduction to Psychology 15th edition. Where does normal end and abnormal begin? This is a deep dive into one of psychology's most complex and really important discussions, and as we'll unpack today, it's a line that's often more fuzzy than clear.
Indeed it is. It's a question that really touches on fundamental aspects of human experience. And like our source material says right away, what one person thinks is extreme, another might see as, well, entirely normal.
Okay, so to kick us off, our source introduces us to Mark Summers. In his autobiography, Everything in Its Place, he describes these worries, stuff far beyond typical childhood concerns.
Yeah, things like needing to place his glasses at a particular angle exactly 7 times.
Right, or grabbing wall molding just the right way because he was afraid his parents would die if he didn't. I mean, this sounds really intense, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And this anecdote, it perfectly illustrates that immediate gut reaction, that feeling many of us have. Okay, these concerns seem extreme, maybe abnormal, or even, well, the word crazy comes up. The chapter itself explicitly states the line between normal and abnormal is sometimes clear, but most of the time is fuzzy.
So our mission today is really to explore just how fuzzy that line can be and maybe why it's so challenging to pin down.
Exactly.
So, okay, without a blood test or a brain scan, how do experts even begin to define abnormal behavior? Our source outlines several criteria. Let's unpack them, starting with one that sounds straightforward but gets tricky fast. Deviation from cultural norms.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that, well, every culture has standards for acceptable behavior. It seems obvious, but a cultural relativist view suggests we should just respect each culture's definitions. Simple enough.
Sounds reasonable on the surface.
But if you connect this to the bigger picture, opponents point out some pretty significant dangers. Historically, people have been labeled abnormal to justify, well, control or silencing them.
Like the example given, Hitler branding Jews abnormal during the Holocaust. That's chilling.
It is, and it raises this vital question for us. If norms shift all the time, how can we have any kind of universal standard? The source points out that even within the same society, what's seen as abnormal changes. Like men wearing earrings once considered abnormal, now it's just, a lifestyle choice for many.
That really makes you think about how much our environment shapes our understanding. But doesn't that create a problem? I mean, if everything's relative, how do we address behaviors that seem harmful everywhere, even if a specific culture accepts them?
That is precisely the dilemma. And it's why just one criterion isn't enough. Which brings us to the next point from the source, deviation from statistical norms.
Okay, this one sounds more scientific, right? Based on numbers.
It does. And abnormal literally means away from the norm. So many characteristics think height, intelligence. They follow a bell curve. Statistically speaking, an abnormal person would be, say, unusually tall or short, or maybe extremely intelligent, or even extremely happy.
Ah, but there's the catch.
Exactly. You see the problem right away. We wouldn't classify someone as abnormal in a problematic sense just for being brilliant or, always cheerful.
Right. Being statistically unusual isn't the same as having a disorder.
So statistical frequency alone, not enough.
Okay, crucial distinction. So if stats aren't the whole story, what's the next piece of the puzzle?
The next criterion is maladaptive behavior. This one shifts the focus. It looks at how behaviors, thoughts, or feelings affect the well-being of the person, or maybe the social group.
Affect well-being, so like causing harm.
Yeah, maladaptive experiences have adverse effects. Think about the examples, like a man so afraid of crowds he can't take the bus to work.
Or someone who's drinking costs them their job.
Exactly. Or violent outbursts that harm society. These behaviors interfere with functioning, or they hurt others. Makes sense.
Yeah, that seems like a really important factor. And finally, the fourth one.
Personal distress. This one feels very immediate, very human.
Okay.
It considers the individual's own subjective feelings, anxiety, depression, agitation. Maybe they can't sleep or have physical aches. Most people who get diagnosed with a mental disorder, they feel, as the book puts it, acutely miserable.
And sometimes that might be the only thing someone else notices. Or maybe not even notice.
Precisely. Sometimes this personal distress is the only symptom really visible, maybe only to the person experiencing it, but it profoundly impacts their life.
So we've got these 4 criteria: social deviation, statistical frequency, maladaptive behavior, and personal distress. What's the biggest, common misunderstanding people have about defining abnormality? How do these 4 help clear that up?
I think the biggest misconception is that there's a single checklist or some clear line you cross. What our source really clarifies is that in most cases, all 4 criteria are considered, but none of them, on their own, is usually enough. It's not about finding one perfect definition.
Right. It's about how these different factors work together.
Exactly. To form a more complete picture.
Okay, so if defining abnormal is this tough, what about normality? Is it just not being abnormal, or is there more to it? Does the source give us a positive definition of well-being?
Yeah, normality is arguably even harder to define. But it's definitely not just the absence of problems. Our source suggests most psychologists would agree on about 5 key characteristics. These indicate emotional well-being. Healthy individuals tend to have these to a greater degree.
But it's a spectrum, right?
Right.
Not like you have it or you don't.
Exactly. Not sharp distinctions. So number 1,
Appropriate perception of reality.
which means basically being realistic, appraising yourself and the world accurately, not constantly misinterpreting things.
Okay. Second, ability to exercise voluntary control over behavior.
Right. Feeling confident you can control your actions, restraining impulses when needed, making deliberate choices.
Third is self-esteem and acceptance.
Yeah, having a sense of your own worth, feeling accepted by others, being comfortable, sort of spontaneous in social situations, but also, not just going along with the crowd if you disagree.
Makes sense. Fourth, ability to form affectionate relationships.
So forming close, satisfying relationships, being sensitive to how others feel, but without making excessive demands on them.
And the last one is interesting, productivity.
Yeah, channeling your abilities into something productive, having enthusiasm for life, not that chronic lack of energy or fatigue we sometimes see.
Looking at those 5, it paints a picture of, like, thriving, not just surviving.
That's a great way to put it, a holistic sense of thriving.
Okay, so we try to define abnormality, we look at normality, and then we try to categorize these things. Classifying mental health problems sounds practical, very useful, but it comes with its own challenges too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
On the one hand, a good classification system like the ICD-10, which is used internationally, or the DSM-IV, used more in the U.S., has real advantages.
Like what?
Well, it can help uncover different causes by grouping similar symptoms together. It lets professionals communicate quickly, concisely. You say post-traumatic stress disorder, and that conveys a lot of information efficiently.
It helps guide treatment, I imagine.
Exactly. Crucial for deciding on treatment approaches.
Okay, but what are the downsides? Where do the dangers lie with these labels?
The dangers pop up if we let that diagnostic label carry maybe too much weight. It can make us overlook what's unique about each person's case. We start expecting them to fit the label perfectly.
And the label isn't an explanation either, is it?
No, that's a key point. It doesn't explain why the behavior started or why it continues. And then there's the issue of stigma, which unfortunately is still a reality in many societies when someone gets diagnosed.
Yeah, definitely. Now, the source also mentions an older distinction, neuroses versus psychoses. What was the thinking behind that historically?
Right. Historically, neuroses were seen as conditions marked by anxiety, unhappiness, and maladaptive behaviors, but usually not needing hospitalization. The person could still function, maybe just not optimally.
Okay, and psychoses.
Psychoses were considered more serious. They involved disturbed behavior, thought processes, maybe losing touch with reality, finding it hard to cope. Hospitalization was more common.
But modern systems are more specific now.
Oh, yes. Systems like ICD-10 and DSM-IV are much more precise, moving beyond that broad neurosis-psychosis split.
Okay, now this next part is really fascinating, especially thinking back to that cultural deviation point. The source talks about culture-bound syndromes. Can you give us some examples? This really highlights the cultural lens, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a remarkable area. Many cultures recognize mental health issues that just don't map neatly onto standard Western classifications. For instance, there's amok, found in places like Malaysia, Laos. It involves brooding, then sudden violent outbursts, persecutory ideas, and often amnesia afterwards.
Okay, what else?
Ataque de nervios, common in Latin America. It involves things like uncontrollable shouting, crying, trembling, sometimes aggression or even seizures, often linked to daily stress or sometimes spiritual causes.
Okay.
Then there's koro, seen in Malaysia, China, Thailand. It's this sudden, intense fear that one's genitals, penis for men, vulva, or nipples for women, will retract into the body and cause death.
That's very specific.
Very. Or taijin kyofusho in Japan, an intense fear that your own body displeases, embarrasses, or is somehow offensive to other people.
And the source mentions others too.
Yeah, things like ghost sickness, lata, susto. Each one is unique, and really underscores how culture shapes how distress is experienced and expressed. These syndromes strongly suggest that our Western diagnostic manuals, like the DSM, might not be the universal lists we sometimes assume they are. Abnormality really can't be fully defined without that cultural context.
So we've got this complex idea of abnormal behavior. We categorize it, sometimes culturally. But what about the causes? Why do these issues happen? Our chapter explores different perspectives on this.
Right. The attempts to understand the why usually fall under a few broad perspectives. First, there's the biological perspective, often called the medical model. This suggests mental health problems are basically brain disorders. It looks at genetics, brain structure, neurochemistry.
And often favors drug treatments.
Often, yes. Then you have the psychological perspectives, which focus more on how the mind functions. This includes the psychoanalytic perspective, think emphasizing unconscious conflicts, often starting in childhood. There's the behavioral perspective, looking at how fears get conditioned, how reinforcement shapes maladaptive behaviors through learning.
Learning, interesting.
And the cognitive perspective, which suggests problems come from maladaptive ways of thinking, biased thought processes.
And finally,
cultural or sociological perspectives. These view problems as rooted in the social context, things like discrimination, poverty, or just how a culture shapes the way distress shows up.
Wow, okay. That's a lot of different angles. Biological, psychological, social. It sounds like a really complex interaction. Is there a way to kind of put these pieces together, an overarching framework?
Yes, exactly. That's where the vulnerability stress model comes in. It's presented as an integrative approach. It considers the interplay between a predisposition, some kind of vulnerability that makes someone susceptible.
Which could be biological, like genes.
It could be biological, like genetic factors, yes. Or it could be psychological, like maybe a chronic feeling of hopelessness. That's the vulnerability part. And then it looks at the stressful environmental conditions a person encounters.
So having the vulnerability doesn't automatically mean you'll develop a problem.
Exactly. It depends on the stressors, things like poverty, frustration, major losses, traumatic events. This model helps explain why, some people develop severe problems with seemingly minimal stress, while others go through immense difficulty and remain relatively resilient.
That makes a lot of sense. It's the combination.
Precisely. Interaction is key.
Okay, so now let's maybe look at how these definitions and ideas about abnormality actually play out. How do we see them in some specific examples of psychological disorders mentioned in the chapter?
Right. We can see these criteria manifest in different ways. Take anxiety disorders, for instance, like Mark Summers' OCD we talked about, or someone like Hazel mentioned in the text with panic attacks. These clearly show significant personal distress. And also maladaptive behavior. The intense fears interfere with daily life. They're out of proportion and often lead to avoiding situations.
Okay. And what about mood disorders? Things like depression or bipolar disorder?
Oh, these vividly illustrate personal distress, that unrelenting psychological pain, despair, or maybe the extreme elation and mania. And there's usually clear maladaptive behavior too, impacting work, relationships, motivation, just daily functioning.
Schizophrenia seems different, though, like a much more profound break from, well, normal reality.
Yes, exactly. Schizophrenia is a prime example of severe deviation from normality in thinking, perception like hallucinations and delusions, and also emotional expression. This often leads to profound maladaptive behavior and seriously impaired daily functioning.
Okay. Then there are personality disorders like antisocial or borderline personality disorder. How do they fit?
These are characterized by long-standing, deeply ingrained patterns of maladaptive behavior. They affect how someone copes with stress, forms stable relationships, maintains self-esteem.
So they directly hit those characteristics of normality we discussed earlier, like
Yeah.
forming relationships, self-esteem.
Precisely. They represent enduring difficulties in those core areas of functioning.
And finally, the chapter mentions pervasive developmental disorders, like autism. How do these fit into our framework?
Well, these disorders typically start in childhood. They involve severe, lasting impairment in areas like social interaction, communication, and the range of activities and interests. While they have very distinct features, they clearly demonstrate a profound deviation from typical developmental norms. You see significant deficits in areas we usually expect, like social connection or symbolic play.
Okay. And, to really hammer home just how fuzzy this line between normal and abnormal can be, the source includes this great seeing both sides discussion. Is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, overdiagnosed? This seems like a perfect example of applying these definitions in the real world and the controversies that
This is
arise.
a fantastic example, really captures the ongoing debate. So on one side, the arguments for overdiagnosis. People point to the huge increase in stimulant prescriptions, especially in the US,
Right, you hear about that a lot.
and big differences in diagnosis rates between different regions. This suggests maybe the criteria aren't being applied consistently. Some argue it's become, well, fashionable maybe, to blame school failure or job problems on ADHD instead of, say, personal responsibility. Or that normal kid behaviors like being bored or restless get mislabeled.
And they mention issues with how it's diagnosed.
Yes, critics note that really high prevalence rates often come from simple rating scales,
Sure.
not from applying the full diagnostic criteria like symptoms starting before age 7 and causing impairment in multiple settings, like home and school.
Okay, so that's one side. What about the arguments against the idea of overdiagnosis?
Well, the counterargument suggests ADHD has likely always been around, but now we're just better at recognizing and diagnosing it appropriately. They point to changes like the 1991 update to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA in the U.S., which mandated screening for ADHD in schools, potentially leading to more identified cases.
So more awareness, better screening.
Potentially. They also highlight that when similar diagnostic criteria are used, rates in other countries can be comparable to the U.S. And maybe most importantly, proponents stress that the individuals who are diagnosed genuinely experience significant impairments in their daily lives, things like peer rejection, academic struggles. These impairments justify the label, they argue, and signal the need for evidence-based treatments.
So it really boils down to this tension. How do we make sure people who need help get diagnosed without over-applying the label, balancing access and accuracy?
Exactly. How do we balance diagnostic accessibility with diagnostic rigor? It's a tough question with no easy answers.
So after all this, what does it all mean for us? Our deep dive into Atkinson and Hilgard really shows that this question where normal ends and abnormal begins, it's incredibly nuanced, isn't it? There's no single objective test you can take. Instead, we're relying on this combination of criteria, social norms, statistics, impact on life, personal feelings, and even those are shaped by culture and change over time.
Yeah, if you connect this to the bigger picture, it just underscores that mental health isn't some simple on-off switch like ill or well. It's this really complex interplay of biological vulnerabilities, psychological tendencies, environmental stresses, all viewed through the lens of our society and our culture.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. Given how fluid and, frankly, subjective these definitions can be, and keeping in mind that warning from the source about diagnosing yourself or others, why might it still be such a profound relief for someone to finally receive a diagnosis, a label, for the distress they've been experiencing?